Welcome to I'd say roughly 10-minute review of Chapter 23, Sections 1 and 2, The Growth of Western Democracies. And in tonight's lesson, we're going to be focusing on all of the reform that's sweeping through Great Britain, the economic, the social, and the political reforms. One of the things that I did is I decided to give you the key terms for both sections. If I had to boil it down to these terms, the most important terms, I should say, for the first two sections, it would be these: Rottenborough, William Gladstone, not Gladstone, but Gladstone, Benjamin Disraeli, the Great Reform Act of 1832, the Chartists, Queen Victoria, the Reform Bill of 1867, parliamentary democracy, potato famine, and home rule. In addition to the key terms, I've also provided you with some important essential questions for both sections. Now, if you notice, I normally give you 5 questions for each section. I decided to give you 5 questions for 2 sections. See how nice I am? Let's look at the 5 questions quickly. First of all, why were parliamentary reforms needed? Second, how did the Liberal and Conservative parties contribute to the spirit of reform? Third, what effects did political reform have on the expansion of suffrage or voting in Great Britain? Fourth, you should know the social, economic, and political reforms in Britain at the time that these 2 sections are taking place. And then fifthly and finally, why did Ireland and Britain have so much conflict? And we're going to be talking about that in a minute. Very interesting story. Essential question number 1, or EQ number 1. Why were parliamentary reforms needed? Basically, Parliament was a hot mess. And Parliament was a hot mess because the wealthy controlled basically everything. Remember when we talked about the Industrial Revolution and one of the negative effects of the Industrial Revolution being that because so many farmers lost their farms, they had to move to the city. Well, they left all that land behind, so who's there to scoop up all the land? Your wealthy landowning people. And they do it with great ease. Now the problem is that even though there aren't that many of them there or who are left, they still have the majority representation in Parliament. All those rural folks who moved to the city don't really have any political power. They don't have a right to really vote. Less than 5%, in fact, of people in Great Britain at the time had the right to vote, and that is a major, major problem. In addition to that, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Now, these are the 2 houses that make up Parliament. House of Lords had far too much power, including veto power. And veto simply means you reject a law. So if the House of Commons came up with a law, the House of Lords could say, we don't like it, and they could strike it down. And there's nothing that the House of Commons can do. That's too much power. In addition to all of that, you have Catholics and non-Anglican Protestants who couldn't vote or serve in Parliament. So you have all these things going on. We have the rotten boroughs with the small population controlling Parliament. And all of those, of course, are your wealthy landowning people. You have the House of Lords having way too much power over the House of Commons. And then you have religious discrimination taking place and keeping people out of Parliament. So, yes, reforms are absolutely necessary. And the way that reform is going to take place is going to come in the form of the Great Reform Act of 1832. And in this act, it does 3 important things. Number 1, it gave representation to large towns and cities. Number 2, it finally eliminated the rotten boroughs. And finally, it enlarged the electorate by granting suffrage or voting rights to more men, yet, and this is important to remember, they still maintained a property requirement. All that means is that men still had to own a certain amount of property before they would be allowed to vote. EQ number 2. How did the Liberal and Conservative parties contribute to the spirit of reform? Well, remember, we have 2 major political transformations taking place here. First of all, Benjamin Disraeli led the group called the Tories. Now, the Tories are going to be transformed into the Conservative Party. William Gladstone, he takes the Whigs, WHIGS, and he transforms that party or leads that party into the Liberal Party. That's what they're called. So we have conservatives and liberals, and you know their political roots now. Well, each group is going to contribute something to the spirit of reform. Conservatives are going to give the vote to working class men through the Reform Bill of 1867. And they are also going to improve the public health and housing for workers. That happens under Disraeli. Liberals, of course, don't want to be left out. They also extend suffrage. This time, of course, they extend it to farm workers. And this is going to fulfill many of the Chartists' ambitions. I'm not going to tell you who they are because you should already know who they are based on your reading. In 1911, the Liberals also passed laws to basically put the House of Lords in check and to prevent them from dominating Parliament. And eventually what's going to happen is that the House of Commons is going to have the most influence on policy. And then finally, the Education Act called for free elementary education for all children. That happens under Gladstone. Alrighty. EQ number 3. What effects did political reform have on the expansion of suffrage in Great Britain? We've already mentioned the Great Reform Act of 1832, and we've already mentioned the Reform Bill of 1867. Now don't get those two confused. There's something else that happens that is a major shift in Great Britain, and it is the shift from a constitutional monarchy to a parliamentary democracy. And in this new form of government that Britain is going to operate from, they're going to have executive leaders, a prime minister and a cabinet, who are chosen by and responsible to Parliament, not the Queen. Very, very interesting. And of course, this is going to open the way for a wider electorate to participate in the election of its leaders, but you have to start someplace. But this is a major shift. Remember, in a constitutional monarchy, yes, you have Parliament, but we know who's on top. It's the king or the queen. With the parliamentary democracy, now it's the prime minister and the cabinet. Very, very interesting. And of course, I keep mentioning them, the Chartists. They get some of their demands met because they're very influential in influencing both political parties to make some important changes. Which kind of leads to the next point, and that is this competition between the liberals and conservatives. It's only going to help the cause of universal suffrage because, bottom line, if you want to be elected, you have to give the people what they want. And if you won't give the people what they want, they're not going to vote for you. Women are finally going to get what they want. Well, if they're 30 and older, of course. Women are finally going to get to vote. I think it's roughly around 1918. It's about 12, 13 years before women get to vote in the United States. But again, remember, the catch here is that you have to be 30 or older. That kind of stinks. But hey, it's a start. EQ number 4. You have to know the social, economic, and political reforms in Britain. You just have to know these. And a lot of this, I call this the basic review slide. The only thing that's new on this slide that we haven't already discussed, the free trade and corn laws, which are in your readings, and you should absolutely know those. Unions being legalized in 1825 is extremely important, even though it's still a crime to strike. One thing that you'll find interesting is the reform in the criminal justice system. At one point, Britain allowed public hangings. They outlaw those. They also create what we now call Australia, because Australia essentially was a prison country or a territory. Remember that Great Britain is an island and a very small one. They could not house all of those criminals, so they had to send them someplace. And that someplace was Australia and also New Zealand, for that matter. And that is how both of those countries got their start. Something they're probably not too proud of, but hey. By the way, I love Australians. I just wanted to point that out. Alrighty. And finally, why in the world does Ireland and Britain have so much beef going on? Why is there so much conflict between these two countries? Well, in order to understand that, it all goes back to the fact that the Irish had been colonized by Britain, and they didn't want to be colonized by Britain. Remember, in colonization, you have the big, powerful country that takes over the smaller, less powerful country for its own economic gain. This is a part of building that empire, that imperialistic mindset that's going to sweep through so much of the world and basically lead to World War One. The Irish never accepted English rule, and they wanted home rule. And they weren't going to stop until they got it. To make matters even worse, the Great Potato Famine, or the not so great Potato Famine, swept through much of Ireland. And basically what happened was they had a really, really bad crop, and some kind of bug had affected, the potato crop. So you got all these black potatoes that no one could eat. There were a few good ones, and what the British did was they shipped all of the good potatoes out of Ireland. And they basically sent them to the wealthy folks in Britain. To this day, the potato famine is still a bone of contention between Great Britain and Ireland. You don't want to go to Ireland and say, the potato famine wasn't that bad. You'll get shot. I'm just telling you that right now. Okay, maybe you won't get shot, but you'll get dirty looks, I promise you. Now here's the ironic part. In 1914, Parliament actually does pass a home rule bill that will allow Ireland to have its freedom. But guess what happens? World War One. Yeah, that kind of stinks. But what can you do? For tomorrow, make sure you are ready for a quick write review right at the beginning of class. No exceptions. Also, I am providing an opportunity for you to earn some bonus points. So here is your bonus question. It is due at the beginning of class, no exceptions, and it must be written on an index card. This concludes our mini lecture on sections 1 and 2. Any questions, concerns, thoughts you have, you can always hit me up on Ngrade, or you may ask me in class. Can't wait to see you guys in the morning. Smooches.